Hello,
Hello?
Dr. Sachs? Oh,
Yes.
yo, hi, in person. Very nice to meet you. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Sachs. It is a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so
Um,
much.
yeah, I know you're very busy, so we're gonna start recording this session, and in order to synchronize our audio system, I'm gonna clap my hands, and then we're gonna just dive right in. That's okay with
Great.
you. What
That's
time is it over
perfect.
there? I can't hear your voice somehow. I don't know why.
Can you hear me
Um,
now?
um, kind of.
Where are you this evening?
We're here at the Lakeland University Tokyo campus, right nearby the sumo coliseum, the sumo ring.
Oh, really? Great.
Yeah. You've been to Tokyo a few times then?
Of course, countless times. Yeah, that's great.
All right. All right. Well, let's get right to it. So let me do the intro, if I may.
Welcome to Dempa. I'm your host, Kevin Keochi, here with my co-host Unicorn and Reina, who will be helping us with the translation. Today we are joined by Senator Satsuki Katayama from the House of Councilors. She'll be showing up soon. And we're thrilled to have Dr. Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia University on our show. Dr. Sachs is a world-renowned economist, former professor at Harvard University, and currently teaches at Columbia University. Dr. Sachs served as an advisor to Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev and later to Russian President Boris Yeltsin, helping to manage economic policies for several nations, including Poland. And of course, Dr. Sachs is also the key architect behind the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal, the SDGs. Dr. Sachs, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Right, let's get right to it. Dr. Sachs, you were in the front row during the collapse of the Soviet Union and the transition to modern Russia. You were one of the key players in that process. Could you walk us through this historic period and perhaps discuss what actually led to the current war in Ukraine?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me and also for the important question. Basically, we know that the period from 1945 to 1989 is the Cold War, the confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. There's a lot to say about the Cold War. I think it could have been avoided. I think it could have been brought to a close earlier, but suffice it to say the Cold War continued during that period of essentially 45 years. By the end of the 1980s, a reform-minded, dynamic leader came to the forefront of the Soviet Union. That's Mikhail Gorbachev. And most importantly, he was a man of peace. He said, we should end the Cold War confrontation. We should demilitarize our economies. We should scale back or eliminate nuclear weapons. And in the Soviet Union, we should reform our economy and our political system for openness, glasnost. So I very much admired Mikhail Gorbachev. I think he was the great statesman of his age. And he took specific steps to end the Soviet military rule over Central and Eastern Europe. And I witnessed that as an economist working in that region in those years. In 1991, the situation economically in the Soviet Union and politically was very difficult and fraught. This was a major crisis for the Soviet Union. Reform is always hard. The Soviet system had basically ground to a halt. World oil prices were low. The Soviet debt to foreign countries was rising. It was a difficult and unpleasant situation. And I recommended that the Western countries, led by the United States and Europe, should provide financial help to the Soviet Union for a stable period so that the Soviet Union would have time to reform. Well, those ideas were rejected because the Soviet Union was viewed as an enemy in Washington, not as a partner. the Soviet Union itself, September 1991, when the Soviet Union divided into 15 successor states, Russia, of course, being the largest, but then the Baltic states and the countries of Central Asia and so on, becoming independent states. I was asked then to be advisor to the president of the now independent Russia, that was Boris Yeltsin. He too wanted normal, peaceful, demilitarized relations. And I appealed financial help to Russia to stabilize the economy. Once again, the U.S. position was no. Russia will have to do with whatever it has. And given the difficulties, this led to a very deep crisis and a lot of instability and unpopularity. Reform processes in Russia. The U.S. also took advantage of Russia's weakness by using NATO. This is something the U.S. had promised it would not do.
Excuse me, Dr. Sachs, it seems, oh, got cut off. Uh-oh. Yeah, I can see, oh, here we go, you're back.
Very explicitly in 1990. I was leaving off, but I was talking about the fact that the United States reneged on a promise not to expand NATO. And the U.S. had said, we won't move NATO advantage of the Soviet Union, but the United States started to expand NATO. What does NATO mean? It means U.S. military bases closer and closer to Russia's borders. Well, Russia didn't like that. And the Russian leadership said, do not expand NATO. You promised, but now you're doing it. And the United States position was, you're too weak to matter. We can do what we want. And this is where U.S. arrogance came in, because the U.S. said, we are the only superpower in the world, so we'll do what we want. We'll go to war where we want, like in Iraq, even if the UN says no. We will expand our military bases where we want. We will decide who is evil and who is good. And so the U.S. took a very aggressive position telling the Russians, you're nothing, you don't count. We determine everything.
So when you say we,
Thank you.
Who was the president back then? Was it Ronald Reagan?
No. All of this started in the last year of the George H.W. Bush Senior administration in 1992.
Bush 41.
Then it continued with Clinton, Bush Jr., Obama, Trump, and Biden. So this is a consistent policy of the United States that goes back to 1992, which was the last year of Bush Sr.
I see.
And the point I'm making is that by treating Russia with such disrespect and by taking moves, many moves, that the Russians felt threatened their national security, most of all NATO enlargement, but many other things, leaving nuclear arms treaties like the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, leaving the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty in 2019, having many wars with Russia's allies, like in Syria, Iraq, Libya, engaging in overthrows of governments in Russia's neighborhood, the so-called color revolutions. Russia said our national security is a threat, and we don't accept this continuing militarization of Ukraine on our border. That's why we have the war.
I see. Well, To the Japanese, Russians are considered Europeans, and most Japanese people may not understand why Europeans and Americans dislike them so much. I mean, literally, is it because of their vast landmass? Why can't they join the European club?
Well, Russia is both European and Asian, of course. It's 11 time zones. It's a vast country. It has been so since the Russian-European side conquered Siberia several centuries ago. And of course, Russia and Japan clashed in the Far East, definitely Asia. So Russia is the Eurasian country par excellence, both Europe and Asia. But the reason why there is a clash between the US and Russia is, in my view, because they're both superpowers, and the United States says there's only room for one of us in this town, as they used to say in the Western movies in the United States. In other words, we're going to be the superpower, you're going to be the subordinate power. This is the same reason that Britain and Russia went to war in the 19th century, because Britain was a great empire then, and Britain essentially attacked Russia in Crimea in 1853 for the same reason, which was that Britain said, we don't want Russia to be a great empire threatening our empire. Britain had a kind of crazy idea that Russia would invade India through Central Asia. And since India was the prized possession of the British Empire, Russia was viewed as an enemy. So I don't think that there's something deeper than that. It was said during the Cold War that the reason for this hate was communism, but Russia's not a communist country, so that is not the reason. The Cold War basically continued after 1991.
Okay, now with China rising, and is United States fighting a two-front war? Do you think Taiwan is going to be the next Ukraine?
Well, Taiwan could be the next Ukraine if the U.S. provokes that. I believe very strongly the People's Republic of China want a war with the People's Republic of China, wants Taiwan to be clearly recognized by all side parties part of China. When Japan has diplomatic relations with China, Japan recognizes Taiwan as part of China. Same with the United States. In our agreement of 1972 and then again of 1979, the United States says clearly that Taiwan is part of China. And yet, the United States arms Taiwan against the PRC red line. It would be a little bit, frankly, like Japan saying to the United States, well, you know, we're one country. We don't want you to arm Hokkaido. If you think about it, we don't want you to arm Yokohama. We don't want you to send armaments. This is our national policy. But the United States says, no, we do what we want. That's the U.S. position. And this could get us into a war with China over Taiwan the same way that it has gotten us into a war with Russia over Ukraine. The United States needs to learn to listen to its counterparts, in this case to China. The United States is not all-powerful. The United States should respect the red lines of the People's Republic of China. The United States should abide by its diplomatic agreement that Taiwan is part of China. And in my view, when a place is part of another country, you don't send armaments to it over the objections of the national government. And this is the basic point to keep the peace.
But Dr. Sachs, the Japanese don't have issues with the one China, two systems policy, but when we see Hong Kong turning into a police state right before our eyes, and the Chinese not only claiming Taiwan, but also the Senkaku Islands, combined with all the cybersecurity breaches we experience, it's easy to lean towards the idea of Chinese expansion. Are they breaking into the first island chain to gain access to the Pacific Ocean?
Well, I think China definitely wants access to the Pacific Ocean, but why not? Why should the U.S. limit China's access to the Pacific Ocean? Come on. This is the open seas. And frankly, Hong Kong is not a police state. It is not a police state. I just visited Hong Kong, not even remotely a police state. But also, it's not Japan to determine what Hong Kong is. It's not the British Empire to determine what Hong Kong is. We need to respect each other's sovereignty. We have a doctrine at the UN of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. The issue of the islands, we know, is an issue that goes back a long time because the territory and these islands counted for very little in the 19th century, so territories were not demarcated. There are legitimate questions involved. Japan attacked China on multiple occasions. There is a need for diplomacy, that's all. And Japan and China should work these issues out diplomatically. That is the solution to these problems. And as for China's access to the Pacific Ocean, well, the United States has access to the Pacific Ocean, so I'm perfectly happy for China to have access to the Pacific Ocean. The idea that the United States can keep China away from the Pacific Ocean through Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan policy, and so forth, could get us all into a disastrous war. The idea that, Chinese submarines should not be allowed access. The fact of the matter is we should be dealing with our issues through diplomacy and disarmament, not by the United States asserting control over China's access to the Pacific Ocean. So this, to my mind, is absolutely part of the story here. China views this as a fundamental security issue. I understand their concerns because if you look at the map, the U.S. surrounds China with its military. The U.S. wants to bolster that military against China, in Japan, by the way, with Korea, with Australia, with India. Well, if I were China, I would not be too happy with that. China doesn't have any military bases in the Western Hemisphere. And if China ever tried, it would lead to war. So I would like the United States to treat China the same way that the United States would like to be, and insist that China treat the United States. This is how we avoid mutual nuclear destruction, by respecting each other.
Dr. Sachs, in a recent conversation with Tucker Carlson, you both expressed surprise that Germany is comfortable with having U.S. military forces stationed on their soil. To be honest, we have a similar situation here in Japan. By hosting U.S. troops, we're able to channel our resources into economic growth. Thanks to this arrangement, we built a peaceful, stable country with world-class infrastructure, and at one point, we became the second largest economy in the world. What more can we ask for?
Well, what Japan should ask for is peace and security, and not the prospect of a third world war, and not the prospect of a war with China. And unfortunately, in Northeast Asia right now, the situation is not stable. The situation is not stable because of Taiwan. The situation is not stable because of the DPRK. The situation is not stable because the U.S. is facing off against China and Russia. And Japan is a peaceful country that should not be caught up in a next war. So this is what Japan should want. I love Japan's peacefulness. I love the Japanese constitution, which is getting whittled away step by step in terms of rearmament because the U.S. wants it so. I think that actually you can't rewind the clock to 890. I think that Japan entered a new era of peace. You know, it's interesting, before the arrival of Europeans to East Asia in 1839 with the First Opium War, from the Ming Dynasty to, which was started in 1368, to the First Opium War, there was continual peace in East Asia. You didn't need the United States for peace. China and Japan had peaceful relations. There was no war between China and Japan except once, when one of the Japanese shoguns in the 1590s had the stupid idea to invade Korea and thought he was going to take over the world. He was a little delusional. He was quickly overthrown and replaced by the Tokugawa shogunate. But other than that brief period of the 1590s, Japan and China were continually at peace. Then came the British, the Europeans. Japan industrialized, of course, in the Meiji Restoration. And Japan became rather militaristic and attacked China. And when the Chinese diplomats were very, very sad about this in the 1890s, and they said to the Japanese colleagues, you know, we're Asians, we should be together. We're being threatened by the Europeans. One of the Japanese diplomats basically said, no, we're part of their club right now because we're now an industrial power. So I want to go back to the idea of Asian unity, which I believe in. I want to go back to the idea, which I think is right, of peace in the long peace of East Asia. It's sometimes, by the way, from a Chinese perspective, called the Confucian peace. But China, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam had essentially no war for hundreds of years. And that's how it should be. And you didn't need the United States to make that. This is something that is absolutely within the reach of Asia itself.
Interesting. Okay, well, let's move on to our next topic here. COVID-19. You seem to have this first-hand knowledge of the pandemic, how it all started and what really happened. Could you elaborate on that for us, please?
Yeah, I wouldn't say first-hand knowledge, but pretty good second-hand knowledge because I've studied this in depth, and I've spoken to a lot of people that were engaged in the events around the pandemic. I chaired a commission for the British medical journal, The Lancet, and in that context, I learned a lot and read a lot. My belief is that the virus that causes COVID, which is called SARS-CoV-2, actually was the result of laboratory experiments. And I believe that the United States was the initiator and funder of those laboratory experiments, and that it involved a joint US-China research effort. And it showed up in Wuhan because of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which was part of a network of research teams that included the National Institutes of Health, the University of North Carolina, NIH, and others. This is not 100% proved because there's a lot of secrecy about it. But people who study this closely think that this is by far the most likely scenario. And the true scenario, which says it came out of the marketplace, is pretty much debunked. That approach doesn't fit the data, doesn't fit the timing, doesn't explain the facts, and overlooks what is very worrisome, which is that the U.S. had a very active research program on the SARS-like viruses with the intention of creating more pathogenic viruses as part of what they call the biodefense research program of the United States. So that's an inconvenient fact, which was hidden from the public until somebody leaked the key document in 2022 called the Diffuse, I think 2021 they leaked it, called the Diffuse proposal, which explains, in my view, the origin of this virus.
Wow. Now we're getting to the weeds of conspiracy theory, but right just now,
By the way, if I could say, it is a conspiracy theory, because it is a conspiracy, but not all conspiracy theories are wrong, because conspiracies sometimes actually happen when people get together to do something they shouldn't do. And it is, I think that there is to hide from view what was happening.
Okay, we're just joined by Senator Satsuki Katayama here. She's here. I'll just hand her the mic.
Nice to meet you. Probably you may not remember, but I have been in Ministry of Finance for years before I became politician. And I have spoken to you when you visited International Vice Minister of Ministry of Finance, and we discussed a lot about transition economy of Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union. Very
Wonderful
nice
to see you. Thank you.
Wonderful to see you again, Doctor. So,
That's great.
So, what shall we start with?
Well, maybe
Where shall
about
we
the
start?
election. We can talk about the election.
Which one? President?
Yeah. What is your prediction for the U.S. presidential election, Dr. Sachs?
U.S. president. Okay,
Yeah.
I see. So go ahead.
Yes, you know, I looked at the prediction markets this morning, and they point to a very, very close election, with probably Donald Trump being slightly ahead in the prediction markets. I think that that's right. If I had to guess one or the other, at this point, I would say that Trump has a tiny margin ahead. We're going to see the debates of the two leading candidates shortly. That will change things. There still is a long period of 2 months between now and Election Day, but it's going to be very close, and either candidate can win.
We kind of understand that you're not a big supporter of Donald Trump. According to Jamie Dimon, the former CEO of JP Morgan, Trump was right about a few things: NATO, immigration, tax reform, etc. What say you?
I am not supporting either candidate, and I don't view either party as giving real answers to the problems that the United States faces right now. So I'm not a happy voter. I don't believe that either candidate is adequate to the task. On foreign policy, I think both parties are very anti-China, and I just explained why I am not. I view that as very risky, including for Japan. I want peace and diplomacy, not aggression and militarism. I believe that Kamala Harris is actually more likely to continue the war in Ukraine than Donald Trump. And I think the war in Ukraine is extremely destructive, nasty, and then was provoked by the United States, as I explained. So that doesn't make me happy. I think neither candidate faces up to America's internal challenges, which are huge inequalities between the working class and the professional class. The professionals in America, like my class, is doing quite well. Income's well and prosperity, but the working class is doing quite badly. And nobody gives a real answer to this in the politics. They both are playing games, blame China or blame outsiders for this. Both pretend that they're going to solve the problems through tax cuts. But the fact of the matter is the U.S. budget deficit is already 7% of GDP. So I don't believe that either candidate is telling the truth. They're saying what the voters want to hear. So this is, unfortunately, the situation as I see it.
Yeah. One more thing regarding Donald Trump, about the assassination attempt. Do we see a pattern in the attempts on Donald Trump, the assassination of JFK, and the assassination of our former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe?
Well, first of all, we don't know the real details of the attack on Trump. What we do know is that there was a massive failure of security because a person with a gun, a rifle, was observed climbing a roof many minutes before the shooting started. Well, this is very shocking, and it's never been explained properly what happened. The head of the Secret Service was forced to resign, but like so many things in the United States, we never heard a real account of how such a major security breach could happen. The other assassinations, I think, have their distinct causes. Of course, the tragic assassination of Prime Minister Abe, whom I knew and very much respected, apparently was not even politically motivated. It was motivated by the controversies of this lone assassin, from what I understand. By contrast, the assassination of President Kennedy, again, where the facts have been distorted and hidden from view, in my opinion, was most likely a coup from within the U.S. government. This is not certain by any means, but the official story, called the Warren Commission, is almost completely debunked on all grounds, on forensic grounds, on grounds of the poor process of the commission, on the lack of interest of all of the U.S. leaders after Kennedy's death to investigate properly what happened, even though there could have been assassins still in the midst. Neither the new president, Lyndon Johnson, nor the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, nor the head of the CIA showed much concern. Well, to my mind, that complacency is itself evidence that they rather knew they don't have to worry about other conspiracies. And so I think that, unfortunately, rather disastrously for the United States, probably the John F. Kennedy assassination was a kind of inside job, but we don't know all the details. We have lots of rumors over more than 60 years. After all, this is 61 years ago. But I've read a lot and studied that issue a lot. And I can tell you, unfortunately, the American people do not believe the official story because the official story has so many flaws in it, it's not believable.
That's very scary. Madam Katayama, would you
Yes.
like to?
Yeah, soon after the assassination attempt of
Shinzo
former
Prime Minister.
not Prime Minister Abe, but the former President Donald Trump, I thought about it because it's been 2 years that former Prime Minister has been killed in Yamato Saidaiji, and it was his 2 years after なんて言うんだろう、3回忌ってなんて言うんですか、英語で。How do we explain
Anniversary,
this?
like
We don't say anniversary for these people.
no.
His death was in July 8th, so it's been two years past. about 2 months ago.
Yeah.
And
Since
we
the-
all went to Yamato Saidaiji. And I'm not a believer of a conspiracy story. And I myself had experience to have a microphone and speak about supporting communal leader, mayor or 市会議員だから member of communal parliament.
Right.
And
Assembly.
that's the point. The point that Shinzo Abe was standing was not necessarily the point. Anyone can stand. So it was all by coincidence. 5 or 6 coincidences accumulated. He shouldn't have gone to Nara because Nara's candidate didn't need further help because his predicted score was above the rival. But he went to Nara instead of Nagano. Nagano's candidate had a scandal. So surroundings of Prime Minister Abe tried to avoid that Prime Minister was mixed up with that scandal.
See.
And that candidate was too weak to be supported by former Prime Minister. So they suddenly changed the schedule. And it was in the middle of public work on that corner. So the place that he had a microphone has been replaced. And the date, some coincidence and the myth of probably surrounding policeman. It's more we cannot regret anymore, but it happened. And the loss as a leader of conservative scene, of conservative political scene of Shinzo Abe was too deep. We are still struggling.
Yes.
The impact was
Yeah.
huge. The
Especially
impact.
on the conservative political scene. He was really only leader. But we tried to get together to stand up and rewrite the center corner of where we should be and what we should do. For example, the coming election of our president and probably following the general election. That's it.
Okay.
That's too big for us.
Yeah.
That was too big for us.
Thank you very much for that. I don't know these information, certainly myself, but I do know how traumatic this is, how tragic and traumatic this loss was when you lose a major leader like Prime Minister Abe. It's a massive shock for society, and this is certainly the case. And it's also the case, at least in the United States, we never really find out what happens because there isn't an honest, systematic, objective analysis and report on this. And in the US context, that has a very, very big lasting effect. Never knowing what really happened with John F. Kennedy, never knowing what really happened with Robert Kennedy, never knowing what really happened with Martin Luther King, and so on, and Malcolm X, all these assassinations, and then never knowing the truth, having many points of evidence that the official story is false, but then not knowing what the real story is. And it's very traumatic for society because it leads to the loss of trust and the loss of direction.
Yes. Speaking of conspiracy theories, how do you feel about Victoria Nuland becoming your colleague at Columbia University? Do you get to sit with her on occasion?
Well, we haven't met yet. I've spoken often about the fact that I absolutely do not accept U.S. foreign policy over the last 30 years, which has tried to impose a unipolar world and China doesn't want a unipolar world led by the U.S. Russia doesn't want a unipolar world led by the U.S. India doesn't want a unipolar world led by the U.S. I would say no country wants, other country wants to be led. What they would like is peace and cooperation. So I have many colleagues who were senior U.S. officials. I don't see eye to eye with them. At least the wonderful part about a university is that it can be a big place with diverse views. And I have my own, and I continue to speak out about them.
Would you ever sit with her at one point to discuss things? I mean, it could be a very interesting, show.
It's quite possible. I know they have lots of events. I tried to get my own views out to students.
Right.
And so, who knows? It's always possible.
I would love to get a front seat when there's a match between you and.
Thank you so much.
Let me. So, Madam Katayama, would you like to ask?
Yeah, last but not least, I have been a speaker at Eastern Economic Forum at Vladivostok until 2019, that years. Because I was in charge of Russia in the era of Yeltsin, they remember me and they send me invitation every year. And at that moment, Prime Minister Abe was enforcing the friendship with Putin, President Putin. And we are trying to cultivate their real private sector. But to tell the truth, the real private sector economy have not grown in that country. When we started discussion, Mr. Sachs, it was early 90s. So it's been 40 years, 30 years.
40 years.
Time passed. But especially after Putin, they didn't grow the real private economy. It's only resource economy and
Weaponry.
weapon. And we spend money to decrease their nuclear submarine. But in fact, after 10 years, they shift their nuclear submarine from Vladivostok to more northern place, Nahotoka. They survived, or they are becoming bigger, even though Japan spent money for that. And that's one of the many examples. So I have an impression, even to China, that's so, because they are now expanding their deflation to the world, to Japan, to United States, and using its own internal, very particular rules, which are not probably in coordination with WTO that they said they will commit. So, in all, Japan, United States, and the other G7 countries have committed so many things with Russia and with China. But so far, many of them are ignored. So I have an impression that we have been so spoiling them. And I have heard similar remarks from inside China. Their legislation, the third Xi Jinping legislation, are standing just because of the Western society are spoiling them. How do you say?
Spoiling?
Spoiling.
Spoil.
China and
Spoiling.
Russia, both.
Oh.
Let me just say that a world in which the U.S., Europe, Japan are aligned against Russia and China will be a very dangerous world. We need a world where there is diplomacy and cooperation rather than a world of confrontation. For Japan, China is a reality. It's a huge next-door neighbor. It is a major trading partner. And as I said, the long record for China and Japan, if you look not over the last 200 years, but over the last 2,000 years, is a history of peaceful relations. And that is what I would like to promote. And when it comes to Russia, I absolutely believe, because I was there at the start of independent Russia in 1992, that we could have normal, peaceful, commercial relations with Russia as well. The problem is we are told by the U.S. that only the military footing is right, that only confrontation is right, and that it is the democracies versus the autocracies. I don't want to divide the world that way. I want to say that each country has its own government, the way that it organizes it. We shouldn't interfere in the internal affairs of each other's countries, and we should have a normal diplomacy and commerce and mutual investment for the purpose of the well-being of people. So that's the approach that I really want to promote and want to say all the time. It's not good versus evil, that the U.S. is good and Russia and China are evil. It's much more complicated. Everybody has some good, some evil. We need to promote the good and cooperate on that basis. Let me thank you so much.
Okay,
for
thank
the
you very much
chance
for
to
the
be
time.
with you.
Dr. Sachs, thank you so much for joining us. Hope to do this
It's
again.
been an honor and a pleasure.
Pleasure's ours. Thank you very much,
Thanks to
sir.
us.
Thank you.
Thank you.